Thank you, Professor Afaneo, for walking us through the very eye-opening timeline of our economic development and, of course, vis-a-vis the nationalist economic thrusts against neoliberalism. And today, as we experience the rising cost of fuel and basic goods, and in an increasingly uncertain economic landscape, perhaps this is precisely what we need: a clear understanding of our past, its policies, and its failures, so that we are not doomed to repeat it. Perhaps, Professor Afaneo, we should send a copy of this presentation to our national economic advisors. Now, for our final speaker, he is a very familiar name. He is the managing director of the Constantino Foundation and a grandson of Renato and Redentor. He's a writer and senior policy advisor of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. To deliver his talk titled A Continuing Past: Decolonization, Decarbonization, and the Entangled Histories of the Philippines, the Climate Crisis, and the Clash of Metabolisms. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Renato Redentor Red Constantino.
Maraming salamat. Dami nila pala. Thank you for coming to this very important occasion. Din Diyosa, as I said earlier, dami niyo pong fans club sa Negros at sa Iloilo. Kinakamusta po kayo. Mga troublemakers po lahat sila. So, mukhang tunay na mga kaibigan. And our esteemed friends, Dr. Rasya, Karine, Bernard, Tita Inday. Hindi ko alam kung naalala niyo yung estudyante niyo po ako dati. Pero tahimik lang. This convocation is timely, but also, as I think I told Kanjosa earlier, it's also a bit weird for some traditions in UP Diliman. The Department of History has made it often a practice to dismiss Renato Constantino. He's not a historian, he's just a journalist. Bakit ba siya nandito? People talking about him. And then I've also heard a number of friends from journalism. What the hell is a historian doing in the journalism field? Doesn't belong here. As my grandmother, who he worked with very closely, would say, what is wrong with these people? We need to use everything in the toolbox. Which is what I think most of us, I hope, share. This last presentation, I hope, will provide a different perspective. I can talk to you about how prescient Renato and Letty were. Renato, for instance, wrote in 1979 a book that you'll see outside. This is an example. 1979, almost 50 years ago, he was already calling for an energy transition. Solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, moving water. Climate science wasn't mainstream yet then, but he was already talking about the necessity and urgency of an energy transition because of the pain that we're all feeling today, which is volatility. That has always been the twin of dependence on fossil fuels. And he was talking about a switch to renewable energy because of things that we also require now, which is the economic benefits of clean air and clean water. My grandmother, I worked with, and it's a matter of luck. I often keep my friends and people I meet early because I never forget that everything that myself and my family have is because of the work that they've done. So, sabi ko ako rin, marami kami nepo babies din kami. Pero nagdala ako ng ideas sa iba para ibahagi, hindi para sarilihin. I can tell you about these things, but I think I opted to share what I think is more important than their projections. And this is about the narrative of history, about the concept of a usable past that they champion. Because this is their response to something that they've always rejected, which Dr. Razia and Tita Inday had mentioned earlier, a rejection of the vanguard concept, which assumes that the poor cannot think or cannot think on their own, and that an advanced guard is required. Without history, you will always need someone else to teach you. 2 days ago, I was with another group of friends launching a report on bridging opportunities of technology and development between the Philippines and Southeast Asia and China. And I was reminded by a colleague who is now a senior official in the Chinese Renewable Energy Industries Association, that I had worked closely with their boss, who is now retired, in 2005. Because that boss, Li Junfang, had asked me, and I worked with him closely, to help develop the renewable energy wealth of China in 2005, when they were just about to launch the renewable energy law. They moved ahead. And if we have petro states today, they are now an electro state. And we're still grappling with questions that I think Dean Josa and I were grappling with 20 years ago, which is how to accelerate the transition so that we cannot be dependent anymore on the work of others. In 2007, we also launched the first electric jeepney fleet in this country. And the ADB took over, and the government was swayed by promises that quickly amounted to nothing. Constantino Foundation, our work tries to advance the ideals of our founders. This photo that you see in front of you is one example of many. It's about a mural that we caused to be commissioned that is now on display at the main library of the Polytechnic University of the Philippines when I finished. It's about the lives of 3 Filipinos. Leonard Ko, people's botanist, murdered, to now justice is elusive. Mario Rosa, captain in the underground resistance during World War II, food scientist. And Eduardo Quisimbin, orchidologist. The mural challenges the views of many, especially in PUP, because the title itself was a provocation. The title of the mural is Mga Revolutionaryo. And I think some activists were freaked out because they're used to revolutionaries that are armed. And our point was, in Filipino, bakit ang mga revolutionaries atin, yun lamang mga pumapatay? At hindi pwedeng tawagin revolutionary yung mga nagbibigay buhay. Pati sa mga hindi tao. And that's why we have this mural commission. An orchidologist whose name was named, several flowers, orchids were named after him, including Leonard Ko, pati mga hayop named after him. Maria Rosa was more than just inventor of banana ketchup. She saved the lives of so many, killed in the last days of World War II by American shrapnel. A redefinition of what heroism and revolutionary, the tag revolutionary, really, how it's really defined. Similar, for instance, to this tree. You see the same tree in 2 photos. Same tree that I only encountered in Bali. It's actually composed of 3 trees that came together as one. Dalawang native ficus at isang native sa kanila, Alston scolaris. In the Philippines, we call it dita. 3 trees that became 1 tree. Dita is the one that goes up very, very tall. which is in a way a conception that Renato and Letty tried to propagate in their works, which is do not focus on single personalities, but focus on the entire process. See the tree instead of just three separate trees, especially when it comes to our heroes. Some time ago, when I worked very closely with my father-in-law, yung tatay na aking asawa na may bahay na nandito ngayon, ang kababatang kapatid niya ay isang graduate din ng CMC, si Maki. My father-in-law's name is Nestor Pulido. He was once the mayor of Anda in Pangasinan. And one day he asked me, papagawa ako ng monumento. What should we make a memorial? And I said, make a memorial that is unique to the entire country, that tells people how history is really. And so it remains, I think, the only memorial, the only monument in the entire country that has four people in two personas, Rizal and Bonifacio together. Dalawang Rizal, dalawang Bonifacio. Only monument in the entire country where Bonifacio is reading a book instead of just holding a pistol or a blade. And he's reading a book as Rizal leans on him after he was shot. And in the other part of the tableau, he's holding his blade while Rizal is reading. In a way, showing that our heroes actually stood on top of one another and they worked together. Hindi sila nagsasabong at hindi sila dapat pinagsasabong kung nais natin maintindihan ang kasaysayan. Ang kasaysayan na mas makulay sa assumptions ng nakararami. For instance, like this image you see, the image of a Manila galleon, which most Filipinos probably know, but very few know as well, that when you say use everything in the toolbox, that includes science and poetry and literature, as Tita Inday said earlier. The Manila galleon trade would not have been what some have called the first wave of globalization, if not for the Philippines. Because they long used Baltic wood, which the Europeans discovered would only last a few years, if not just a decade. At tinatabla ng mga kanyon. And then they discovered Mulabe, Bitaog, Lawan, Nara, Panaba, which would last 60 years at least, if not more, and repel cannon shot. And thus, the forests around Cebu and the Cavite shipyards were lost. And what remains was finished by American timber companies. So without our forests, the first wave of globalization and the subsequent waves would not have happened. Native trees, botany, biology, and Philippine history can go together. History is interesting also because when you look at certain chapters, you see, for instance, that in 1912, a similar storm ravaged Leyte and Samar, killing thousands like Yolanda did just 100 years before. Very interesting. Or the fact that scientists like Svante Arrhenius already asked the basic question on climate. In April 1896, the year of the Philippine Revolution, asking the basic question, whether the mean temperature on the ground in any way is influenced by the presence of heat-absorbing gases in the atmosphere. Climate science is not new, but it is what the fossil economy and the fossil fuel companies have been trying to suppress. 1896, 130 years ago. But you would not know it because much of the left have forgotten this as well. I don't know of any left organization that celebrated the 150th birth anniversary of Orion, the revolutionary, and Pinkian, the revolutionary, or Pedro Abad Santos, the person, the Filipino, set up the Socialist Party of the Philippines. None. I don't know of any who is preparing to celebrate the 130th year of the Philippine Revolution. Memory, makakalimutin ng bayan, pati ang mga guro at mga kawani at mga nasa kilusan. Kailangan natin mabago ito. Thankfully, history is also very interesting if you teach it and show it in the right way. Many of you perhaps may already know that Jobos, for instance, the dye, actually is from a natural company. Jobos, dun sa mga old school, if you wanted to change the color of your fabric, paki-Jobos muna. But it was a company that's called Jobush originally. Or the Tanzan was the name of a Japanese soda brand. Wasn't the term for bottle cap. Easy, but also interesting. A little bit more complex is the life of Apolinario de la Cruz and Hermano Puli, Friar de San Jose. One day in the middle of the 19th century, Puli applied to the Spaniards to become a priest. Spaniards in short said, no, you're a native, di pwede, Indio ka lamang. And so he felt dejected, set up his own church, pinagbawal ang mga Kastila, the Spaniards were not allowed, Spaniards got angry, they fought, he lost, he was hanged, executed. And yet Puli is someone who is still remembered today. All of you, probably in your households, mention him almost every week, if not every month. How? Persistence of memory again. Because of the way that they finished their prayers. Their church became known for the way they finished their prayers. In English, they would finish it as forever and ever. In Latin, originally, they would say, et secula seculorum. Everything legal we call today, colorum. Colorum ang lisensya, colorum ang diploma, colorum ang prangkisa. We remember the pejorative, but not the chapter in history that spoke about resistance. On the ship, many would call barco. And many would also call a term that they never really realized where it came from. Vapor. But vapor comes from vapor. And vapor is steam, and steam is produced by coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel, which is also the reason, the very fuel that brought the Americans over with their warships to the Philippines. The image beside it is actually an image of one part of the country of Dr. Asia. It's from Labuan, Borneo, where the British officers first discovered a massive coal deposit around the time, maybe 10 years after Puli was executed. That deposit that they discovered marked the moment when the first foreign shores were integrated into the global fossil economy. Remember, in the middle of the 19th century, this was the very economy that Marx was studying in the UK, when British industry moved from the power of water, which was more abundant and cheaper, to the power of coal. Because coal acted like steroids in terms of producing capital and also locating power where labor already was to begin with, which meant that labor was more easily disciplined. And so they switched to coal and produced gargantuan numbers of products, including cheap cotton imports that flooded the Philippine nation, decimated our textile industries, killed off Piña, Husi, Sinamay, and fed the revolution with a lot of disenfranchised workers. Konektado ang lahat, especially the warships that were brought here by the US. Why? Senator Albert Beveridge said it a long time ago, in the language that should be familiar to most, uttered by Trump and Rubio and Hegseth. The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. The wood of the Philippines can supply the furniture of the world for a century to come. Cebu's mountain chain are practically mountains of gold. And if your from Cebu or have visited Cebu, you would know that the ties of beverage to today is present. Because the biggest palengke market in Cebu is still named the same. They just call it Bagsakan or Carbon, but it's still called the Carbon market. If you talk about the Paris Agreement, the climate treaty, they would call it the carbon market. In Cebu, yung palengke ng carbon, yung merkado, it's still there, thriving. Which is it's actually quite important because more Filipinos today talk about the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, the climate treaty, the climate accord. But very few talk about the Treaty of Paris, which, among other things, allow the US to purchase the Philippines and Cuba, even though we had already thrown off the Spaniards. They purchased us, they annexed us forcibly because of certain things. One of them, of course, resulted in what we now call a concentration camp of the bogus war on terror, which is called Guantanamo. Originally, it was a coaling station of the US. But you would not necessarily learn this if you listen to activists correctly protesting the militarization of the country, including by the missiles of EDCA, but not connecting it to the climate crisis or Philippine history. There's also another, which was once the largest overseas naval base of the United States. It was first a coaling station, Subic. And it is the poverty of memory that we can protest issues today without having any discussion on its historical links in our very own history. We think of the Iran War, oil crisis of the 1970s, Iran-Iraq War and the Second Iraq War, without understanding that in this region, we were actually the first to witness what an armed conflict of imperialism that is tied to fossils really looks like. Because even Vietnam had to endure French colonialism, among which was motivated by the desire of the French to extend the imperial power of their navy, which is why the French Prime Minister said in 1885, Tunisia, Indochina, Saigon, Madagascar, those are ours forever, because our navy needs coal on the ships if we are to sustain our own rule. Even the solutions to climate change have historical roots. Not just in 1979, which Renato Constantino pointed to, including mobility solutions. It would surprise probably many of you to learn that Emilio Redentor del Mas, a Spanish journalist, wrote this book about the insurrection in the Philippines, 1896 and 1897. And in this book, he actually said that the Katipuneros were so devious because they would recruit their members by going to the dances, mga baile, where they were feted and so popular because they would come in riding bicycles. So even bicycles have a revolutionary history. But we need to be interested first in what has happened in the past. We will learn, for instance, that the bicycles were so critical to the women's liberation, especially that fought in the United States, which allowed them, the women, to gain the vote, to gain the ultimate objective of the suffragettes. It's even a research agenda because so far, this is the only photo I've seen of a Filipina on or beside a bicycle before World War II. So if you come across any photo on of a bicycle and a Filipina or beside a bicycle, please let me know. This is my rabbit hole and I've been searching for a long time for it. The bicycle was used by the Japanese to sneak behind the British to capture Singapore and the Malayan Peninsula. It was also featured in some of the letters of Renato when they were distributing anti-Japanese leaflets during a very dangerous period while on a bike. even more nicely, it figured massively in the victory of the Vietnamese over the French in Dien Bien Phu, and also when they defeated the American imperialists right after. Much of what is under intense discussion today, from problems to solutions, they all have deep roots in history. The fossil economy is responsible for a lot of brutal wars, but it is also responsible for an even greater proportion of dispossession because of the way it has boosted the dictatorship of accumulation and consumption. And today, worsening climate impacts represent an existential threat to working families around the world, especially the most vulnerable, women and children. Science also continues to tell us the metabolism of nature is colliding with the metabolism of the fossil economy, and that one has to die in order for the other to thrive. And so we must choose life. The fossil economy has to be dismantled, wars need to be stopped, and climate violence has to be defeated. Everyone now feels the pain from the war of aggression on Iran. But eyes are also increasingly focused on the West Philippine Sea dispute. China's bullying is real and it needs to stop. However, we need to also recognize that the Philippines is to China what the United Arab Emirates is to Iran right now. An appendage of the US. I hope, therefore, that tensions de-escalate fast. But I also hope that the dispute remains unresolved, because it means the hydrocarbons under the sea will remain untouched, and thus they cannot harm us. If they are burned, they will. Fossil fuels are a parasite prepared to kill its host in order to thrive. And all we have right now is flag freedom, because fossil dependence is the persistence of colonization. My friends, we cannot decarbonize if we do not fully decolonize. And we certainly cannot fully decolonize without global decarbonization. The US is no longer an enemy, but neither is it our friend today. It's not even a friend of Southeast Asia, as it sets its eyes now on the Strait of Malacca. We must keep it out if we wish to peacefully resolve the territorial disputes in the region. In this region, we share typhoons, we share smoke, but we also share the sun and the wind and moving water. We must stop the bullying, but we must also learn to start sharing more. My last slide I chose because I wanted to emphasize what I began with. The poster you see in front of you is a poster of the French Open, Roland Garros stage in 1994. A globally renowned competition, because uso ngayon si Alex Ayala, and now we can think about it a little bit more. Why did I choose this? Because narratives matter. And we remember we discussed earlier the concept of a usable past, and the way Renato and Letty would push for historical thinking and usable history as a means of liberating the self. The poster you see in front of you of a French competition, it does not even have a player. It has no ball, no racket, no net, no court, no audience. And yet you look at it, you can already see the ball thrown up, lifting, and the racket about to smash it to the opponent's side of the court. It allows you to imagine. And it is vivid in front of us that we see only a hand, and yet we imagine the entire competition of tennis. This is the history that Renato and Letty tried to impart, and what they say is better because they allowed us to imagine with their books what was in the past and what is in the present and what it can be in the future in a way that allows us also to locate who we are and where we want to be and who we should be tomorrow. Because narratives matter and no one should tell us what to do except ourselves. Somebody is bound to say, yes, but without teachings from a vanguard, then people will go astray or make mistakes. Of course. But mistakes is how people gain experience, how we learn, and how we become independent, autonomous societies, a nation, and a nation of Filipinos, a nation, and a nation of Filipinos with a sense of agency. Salamat po. Maraming salamat.